Michael Williams is a Hong Kong University graduate and leading scholar of Chinese-Australian history. He is the author of Returning Home with Glory in Australia's Dictation Test, and has taught at Beijing Foreign Studies University, Peking University, and Western Sydney University. His digital project Chinese-Australian History in 88 Objects was shortlisted for the 2022 Premier's Digital History Prize. His recent book on the robed Chinese walkers and his current project, Scattered Legacy, highlight his continuing contribution to the field. These podcasts are brought to you by ChideStudyPress, publisher of Chinese-Australian History.
Hello and welcome to number 30 in ChideStudyPress's series on Chinese Australian history. Today is a relatively short one, but a very interesting one. It concerns the 1891 Royal Commission to the Police and Chinese Gambling, set up by the New South Wales government. And it's a Royal Commission that is quite fascinating, as you hear our bots discuss, in what it reveals about the Chinese community in the late 19th century, and how bots managed to draw quite a lot of interesting conclusions from that. Now, this is in fact based on, of course, something I wrote many years ago. I discovered this back in the 1990s, so already the Royal Commission was about 100 years old then. Very little used, but I was able to use it in some of my early work, and I think it deserves some revisiting. It has been used by a couple of other historians since then for similar kind of purposes, I think, because of what it reveals about the community, and particularly, because you've got some Chinese witnesses, of course, and their voices are being heard. So again, one of these rare instances where we hear the actual voices of Chinese Australians as opposed to merely observations by more prejudiced or at least ignorant Europeans. So again, I'll leave it to the bots to discuss this, and then I'll conclude and give you a few references at the end. You can in fact read the whole thing for yourself if you wish to on the Internet Archive, which is that wonderful resource that I think we should all make great use of and support. Okay, once again, enjoy.
Imagine a 400-page treasure trove of history, just packed with first-hand accounts and secret societal structures, and it basically sat entirely neglected by historians for over a century.
Yeah, it's wild to think about, just gathering dust.
Right. And the crazy part is how it got made. In 1891, the mayor of Sydney sets up this massive government-funded police inquiry. He was absolutely convinced he was going to take down this unified, citywide Chinese mafia.
Oh, he was certain. He thought this shadowy syndicate was controlling illegal gambling, bribing the police force, all of it.
Exactly. But instead, his inquiry accidentally funded the most detailed historical record of a sophisticated, privately funded international logistics and welfare empire. And his own government didn't even know it existed. Okay, let's unpack this.
I love this one.
Today, we are opening up a report from an 1891 Royal Commission set up by the Premier of New South Wales in Australia. And the mission for our deep dive today is to really change the lens of history.
Yeah, to shift how we look at this entire era.
Because for decades, the Chinese in early Australian history were viewed primarily in this very flat way, either as passive victims of the White Australia policy or, on the flip side, as instigators of anti-Chinese sentiment.
Right, they're usually just treated as a monolithic group that things happen to.
Yes.
Yeah.
But today, we're going to look at them as active players, people with their own complex motivations, and we're doing it using their own actual words.
Which is such a rare opportunity with primary sources from that time. To understand why this specific commission yielded such unique testimony compared to really hostile inquiries in places like California or Canada, we have to look at who was actually asking the questions.
The setup for this is so interesting. So tell us about the background of the commission itself.
Well, so the commission was headed by the mayor of Sydney, and they were investigating specific areas, primarily the Rocks and Wentworth Avenue, which was then known as Goulburn and Wexford Streets.
Okay, the big hubs.
Exactly. And they were going in looking for this massive, monolithic gambling tong that they assumed was controlling all these police bribes.
They wanted the movie villain cartel.
They really did. But the twist is that they found almost zero evidence of police corruption and no single gambling syndicate whatsoever.
Which is just a spectacular backfire. But in their failure They accidentally documented the hidden realities of a deeply fractured but highly organized community.
And that gets back to why this document is so honest. You have to look at the presence of a man named Quang Tart.
Right, Quang Tart. He's such a fascinating figure in this story.
He really is. So Quang Tart was a Taishan-born tea merchant, and he was highly respected by both the Chinese and the European communities in Sydney. And the premier actually appointed him to sit as a commissioner.
Which is huge, right? Like, imagine being a witness in 1891.
Oh, the psychological impact must have been massive.
I mean, you walk into this room bracing for the usual colonial hostility, and there's a fellow Chinese immigrant sitting on the panel.
Yeah, having him there basically reduced the prejudice in the room. It stopped the overt harassment, and it just opened the floodgates for honest testimony.
Because they finally felt like someone would actually understand them. Which brings up this whole idea of deconstructing the monolith. Because the commissioners, they really assumed they were investigating a single, unified Chinese community, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what sociologists call aggregation. They just lumped everyone together. But the witnesses utterly shattered this illusion. They had to explain that the community wasn't unified at all.
So it's the total opposite of what the mayor thought.
Completely. It was deeply divided by districts of origin and dialect, mostly from the Pearl River Delta in southern China.
Which makes me wonder, why is it so common for mainstream society to view immigrant communities as a monolith? And what do we actually lose when historians just accept that flat narrative?
That's a great question. I mean, we lose the actual human mechanisms, the rivalries, the local loyalties. If you read the testimonies of guys like Yuan Tak and Robert Lee Kam, they had to sit there and list out all these distinct communities.
Like the Dongguan, the Zongshan, the Si-Yap.
Exactly, the Gao Yao. And there is this almost humorous frustration from the commissioners. They kept having to have this concept of exclusiveness explained to them over and over.
They just couldn't wrap their heads around it. I love that quote from the witness Wei Shan. Do you have that one?
Oh, yeah, he says, Moi Ping is not of my community. He would not subscribe.
It's just so blunt. Like, I don't know him. He doesn't pay dues to my club, so we have nothing to do with each other.
Right. And then there's Sam Tin, who was accused of being in the Lungi Tong to hide gambling. And he basically explains he wasn't denying membership to cover up a crime. He just says, I do not belong to that part of the country. They would not let me in it.
He literally couldn't join the so-called mafia because he was from the wrong village.
Exactly. The geography wouldn't allow it.
So if these district groups weren't the criminal syndicates the commission was hunting for, what exactly were they doing? Like, what were they doing with these exclusive memberships and all these gathered funds?
Well, the records show they were basically benevolent institutions. They functioned entirely on this concept of cousinship and charity.
Cousinship. I like that term. It implies a real duty of care.
Yeah, it was a massive social safety net, and it was entirely self-funded via subscriptions. For an ordinary worker, it might cost £1 to join.
Which is a lot for a worker back then.
It is. But for the wealthy merchants, the subscription could be up to £50.
Wow, £50. That is serious capital for 1891. So where did all that money go?
What's fascinating here is the immense logistical and financial effort dedicated to the dead.
Ah, yes. The repatriation of bones. This absolutely blew my mind when reading the source material.
It's incredible. There was this deep, deep concern among the Wakyu, the overseas Chinese, that their bodies should not be lost in a foreign land.
Right, because spiritually that was considered a catastrophe. The remains had to go back to the ancestral village.
Exactly. So these societies would actually pay to put empty coffins on all the vessels traveling back and forth between Sydney and China.
Wait, really? Just empty coffins taking up cargo space?
Yeah, because standard maritime practice back then was just to bury people at sea if they died on the voyage. The societies bought the space to guarantee that wouldn't happen to their members.
That is wild. And the sheer numbers and costs involved in exhuming bodies on land are just staggering. The report says it cost £10 to remove one man's bones.
£10 just for the exhumation, yeah.
Yeah. And there's that merchant, Wei Qi. His society spent £529, 19 shillings, and 2 pence just to, what was the phrase, raise 84 bodies.
Right. And over 10 years, they sent 500 sets of bones back. 250 were exhumed from Rookwood Cemetery alone.
I mean, think about that. It's basically a modern, highly sophisticated, privately funded international repatriation insurance policy. And it was completely invisible to the host country.
completely invisible. They even sent money ahead to the Tonghua Hospital in Hong Kong.
To make sure the dead were handled properly once they crossed the ocean.
Exactly. The hospital acted as an NGO to receive the remains and route them to the correct villages.
But to fund a massive social safety net like that, you need massive amounts of capital. So who actually held the purse strings? Because that leads us right into the power dynamics within the community itself.
Yeah, so that brings us to the merchant class. Figures like Wei Qi, whose Kunitong society had 600 members.
600 members just in his one district group.
Right. These societies were run by the wealthy merchants who owned the local stores, and the average laborers relied on them completely.
So it's not a democracy, it's an oligarchy of grocers.
Pretty much. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this creates a system of profound paternalism. Wei Qi held money for the local gardeners and hawkers because, as the testimony says, he was in a larger way of business and was trusted.
Which is a dual-edged sword, right? On one hand, it's a safety net. I think the transcript mentioned Wei Qi had to bail guys out of jail for gambling because it would not look well if a leading man didn't help his community.
Yeah, there was intense social pressure on the merchants to provide that welfare. But on the other hand, it heavily resembled indentured servitude.
Right, the debt bondage aspect. Let's talk about Dr. An Li, because his story is so telling about how trapped some of these men were.
So Dr. An Li was a wealthy figure who brought in 30 immigrants from China. But to get them into the country, he had to pay their poll tax.
And this is the poll tax instituted by the 1888 Restriction Act, right?
Yeah.
100 pounds per person.
Exactly, 100 pounds, an impossible sum for a laborer. So Dr. An Li pays the 3,000 pounds for all of them, but then he locks them into 5 years of low-wage garden work to pay it off.
5 years of their life just gone, working off a border tax.
We have to look at how institutional racism literally forced this reliance. It wasn't just Chinese merchants exploiting their own.
No, the European businesses were totally complicit.
Right. There's testimony from a European shipping agent, Alfred Lowe. He admitted on the record that his company refused to take money directly from ordinary Chinese men.
So even if a gardener saved up his own money for a ticket home, the white shipping agent wouldn't sell it to him.
Nope. They forced the laborers to book their passages entirely through the recognized Chinese merchants.
Which perfectly traps them in that closed economic loop.
Yeah.
You have to use the merchant so the merchant has all the power. And this economic struggle, this crushing weight of the 100-pound poll tax, it directly impacted the personal lives of these laborers.
It dictated everything. And this leads to a demographic reality that utterly fascinated and, frankly, distracted the Royal Commission.
Yeah, let's get into this because the commission just goes completely off the rails here. They largely abandon their brief about gambling and police corruption, and they fixate on the sheer lack of Chinese women in Sydney.
The moral panic was real. They started asking all these invasive questions about the relations between Chinese men and non-Chinese women.
They were just obsessed with the domestic setups. But if you look at the testimony, the witnesses are just trying to explain the basic economics of love and family in 1891.
Right, because most were simply too poor to ever pay the passage for a wife, especially with that poll tax.
Even the wealthy guys struggled. Wei Qi, the guy with the 600-person society, had to wait 22 years to bring his wife over to Australia.
22 years of separation, and he was wealthy. For the average laborer, it was just mathematically impossible.
And led to these deeply pragmatic family arrangements that totally shocked the Victorian commissioners. Like the anecdote from Wei Shang.
Oh, this one is striking. So Wei Shang testifies that he has a wife in China, and he also has a wife living with him in Sydney.
And the mayor is probably clutching his pearls, right?
Totally. But Wei Shang just casually explains, the old wife sent this one out so that I might have children. That is the usual custom in China.
He's just like, yeah, my first wife arranged it so I could have an heir. What's the problem?
It was a practical solution to a geographically split family, but to the commission, it was scandalous. And then you have Yuan Tuck, who the report notes was living in great style with 2 Chinese wives down in the rocks.
Living the dream on the harbor. But they were the exception. The reality for the vast majority of these men was incredibly bleak.
It really was.
Here's where it gets really interesting and just heartbreaking, honestly. The testimony from Chow Koom. The commission asks him, basically, if life is so hard, why don't the old men just go back to China?
And his answer is just devastating. He explains that they have no money left. It was all gone to opium smoking and gambling, leaving them stranded and too old to work.
Could just die alone thousands of miles from home. And the commissioners probably heard that and thought, aha, it's a moral failing. It's the vices.
Which is such a superficial read. You have to realize that opium and gambling weren't just vices in this context. They were the inevitable symptoms of a bachelor society.
Right. A society completely isolated by exorbitant immigration taxes and systemic poverty.
Exactly. You take thousands of men, separate them from their families, give them no hope of ever affording a ticket home, and subject them to grueling physical labor.
The gambling is the only place they have a mathematical chance of a windfall to get home. And the opium is just a painkiller for the labor and the isolation.
It's self-medication against profound psychological trauma.
It makes total sense. But if the life was so lonely, and the labor was so hard, and the host country hated them so much, why stay? Why come at all?
It all comes back to the raw economics, the sheer wage differential.
Yes, the math on this is crazy. We have a witness, Quine Young, who breaks it down for them.
And he's very honest. He says, yes, it costs 4 times as much to feed a man in Australia compared to back home.
But the wages, what did he say about the wages?
He testified that the wages in New South Wales were 20 times greater than in Guangdong province, which they usually just referred to as Canton.
20 times greater. I mean, you can put up with a lot of misery if you're earning 20 times what you'd make in your village.
Exactly. It was an economic magnet,
Wow.
and it drove this massive remittance economy.
Let's talk about the remittances, because even Chow Koon, the carpenter, who was terrified of dying penniless, even he managed to send money back.
Yeah, a simple carpenter sending 20 pounds a year to his wife in China. That is an incredible amount of savings to scrape together on a laborer's wage.
And then you scale that up to the merchants. Wei Qi testified that he sent a staggering 10,000 pounds home in a single box.
10,000 pounds.
And that wasn't just his money, right?
No, it was pooled money. It was his profits, but also the savings from hundreds of laborers who gave him their money to remit for them.
He's basically running an international bank out of his general store. It's brilliant.
It is. But this raises an important question about the timing of this entire snapshot.
Because it didn't last.
No, it didn't. This commission occurred in 1891, and that is a mere decade before the 1901 Immigration Restriction Act.
Which is the law that brought the full devastating weight of the White Australia policy down on the country.
Precisely. Once the colonies federated into a single nation in 1901, they passed laws that effectively slammed the door shut.
They stopped the flow of new migrants, which choked off these district societies.
Right. So this 1891 report, it's really the last great detailed picture of a vibrant, self-organized society before it was systematically dismantled.
It's just wild to think about looking at primary sources like this and actively looking past the biases of the politicians who commissioned them. It reveals so much.
You don't see a monolithic caricature of a criminal gang.
No. You see a highly sophisticated network of benevolent societies, complex economic engines, and deeply human stories of sacrifice.
And I think there's a real lesson here for how we consume news today. When you hear reporting about marginalized or immigrant communities, you really have to ask yourself, are you getting the flattened commissioner's view?
The easy aggregated narrative.
Exactly. Or are you seeing the actual, highly organized, disaggregated human reality beneath the surface?
Such a vital question to ask. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final kind of provocative thought. Something that wasn't explicitly covered in today's deep dive, but it's drawn directly from the opening pages of our source material.
Oh, right, the travel budget.
Yes. So the Premier of New South Wales specifically refused to extend this 1891 investigation outside of Sydney. The mayor wanted to go into the rural areas, and the Premier said no.
He wouldn't fund the train tickets.
Exactly. So if this incredibly rich, complex, invisible world of banking and bone repatriation existed right under the noses of Sydney's politicians, imagine the entirely unrecorded histories of the rural areas.
The thousands of Chinese miners, hawkers, and laborers who lived in the vast expanses of regional Australia.
They must have had their own deeply complex societies, their own power dynamics, their own survival strategies out in the heat and the dust.
We don't have a 400-page transcript for them.
No, because a politician refused to fund a train ride. Their first-hand voices are essentially lost forever. Which makes you wonder, what other histories are currently being lost right now simply because no one is willing to look just past the city limits?
It's a sobering thought.
It really is. So what does this all mean? It means history is only as good as the questions we're willing to ask.
Okay, thank you for that fascinating discussion. I'm sorry for the rather abrupt end to the question at the end. I'm not too sure what happened then to cut cut our pot off, but his questions were as usual quite pertinent. But here we can see we get yet more insights into the Chinese community of Sydney in this instance, and as our bot mentioned, what more could we have found if more work had been done? There was of course another survey of some of the so-called Chinese camps of the Riverina district of New South Wales, done a little bit earlier than this, again involving Kwong Tat. And so there is some sources of what was happening in the rural districts, but they're not quite as complete as this fascinating insight into what was happening in Sydney in the late 19th century. Although, of course, at this point, the Chinese language newspapers are beginning to be established, and so we are getting more and more information. At that point, if you care to read through these Chinese language newspapers, which are, of course, all available on Trove. But if you want more information, more direct links about reading material concerning this kind of material, then check the notes or write to me at ChideStudyPress at gmail.com. Thank you very much for your listening.